All right. It looks like we're live for our channel office hours. If you're joining us on one of the social media channels, Facebook, Instagram, or X, welcome. I'm Nick Weber, the moderator for this. And with me today, we have Katherine Rod, who's from Northern Illinois as an agronomist. All of our folks are agronomists. Katherine Rod's from Northern Illinois. Lindsey Novak up from North Dakota. Andy Swanson's over in East Nebraska, and Todd Vagts from Southeast Minnesota. So welcome to all of you. Today we're going to talk about soil fertility. And as we put this together, our agronomists all said, thanks for kicking off office hours with the hardest topic to talk about sometimes for agronomists. So we'll do our best to answer some questions here. We've got a good conversation planned, and then certainly listening in on watching on one of the channels, please reach out in the chat and comments and put in some questions if you had any. We'll do our best to get to them here. So again, excited to get this started. It's the first time we've done this, so we'll have a little kinks, but we'll work through them, and looking forward to a good conversation. So I'm going to start here with a question for most of you here. We'll dive into just sort of why soil testing is important. And so I'll start with Katherine here first of, why is that so critical as farmers get ready for 2025 here? It's late January, probably could have done some things in the fall, but certainly there's some opportunity to do it in the spring. So kind of talk to us a little bit about why soil test? Why should we be thinking about that right now?
Yeah, so soil tests are really important. So the roots feed the plant. And if you have healthy roots, you have a healthy plant. And a lot of nutrient and water uptake happens from the roots. And so we need to have the best start for our plants that we can. And that starts with soil fertility. The best thing to do is to actually know what your soil fertility is. And to start with that is the best thing to do is a soil test. I generally recommend doing it every 3 to 5 years, depending on your farming situation, soil type, that type of stuff. And then from there, you can look and see what type of potassium and phosphorus and other macro and micronutrients that you might need for your crop, in addition to a nitrogen if you're going into corn or going straight to soybeans.
All right. And Andy, as you kind of look at that over the course of the soil tests every few years, maybe even every year, some people do, we'll switch over to the Central Plains area. Is there anything different from what Katherine said when we talk about geographies and what you guys look for in a plains environment?
Well, I'm sure we're not a whole lot different than everybody else, but seems like the soils are a mess. We don't know what we want to be when we have soils here in Nebraska. We've had glaciers move in across part of the state and everything else, and so we've got even in some fields where in an 80 we'll go from 4.5 pH to 8 pH across the way. So we're a little confused, but soil testing again is pretty important to figuring all that out. And I would say that right now, I mean, I'm always a bigger fan of the more detail you can get, the better. And so I like grid sampling, but with corn and bean prices where they are today, I mean that doing the grid sample across every acre maybe isn't feasible for some people and want to cut back on costs, but doing a composite sample at the very least, you need to know what you're dealing with in the soils, and if you can't measure it, you don't know.
For sure. So looking back from last year, I'm sure we can learn a lot of stuff. So Todd, and we'll probably go around the whole room on this one, virtual room that is. But start with Todd and over to Lindsey. Talk about some of the things that happened last year for the Minnesota area that, we had a wet spring for a good chunk, particularly in your area, very dry, late summer, fall, fast harvest. Were there certain conditions that the farmers in your area need to be thinking about based on last season as they head into their fertility planning for this season?
Sure. Thanks for the question, Nick. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of, as you look across the state of Minnesota, we had a lot of variances of weather factors. A lot of precipitation is pretty common across most of the state. But then particularly as you look at South Central, where we had extensive precipitation throughout the year, certainly will impact, and as you look at like your phosphorus, potassium, won't necessarily impact those other than the fact of how much was taken up during the season. So if you look at the far eastern part of the state, we actually had fairly good crop yields versus the central. So as I kind of look at it, it's like, how much of those nutrients were removed from the crops, or where we had low to medium yields. You can maybe take some credit yet for some of the P&K that you put on last year. Whereas more in the eastern part of the state where we had good yields, maybe actually need to add more to help compensate for nutrients that were removed. Now, as for P&K, nitrogen obviously is a different situation. We typically fertilize nitrogen based on each and every year, but particularly we had a lot of moisture last year. We pretty much flushed the soil profile out, so don't expect any residual in a lot of these areas to be present as we go into 2025.
Gotcha. Lindsey, what about over in the Dakotas area? What are you guys seeing as you prepare for 25 and from a fertility perspective?
Well, I can speak to a lot of the comments that Todd had just mentioned, with North Dakota and Minnesota being neighbors. Sounds like we had some similar weather patterns. I guess two things I'd like to talk or mention specifically is potassium and then nitrogen. So potassium might be something that we put on the back burner, especially since we have this concept of building up your soil bank, and perhaps you think, well, my bank is full with potassium and I'm going to choose not to apply that just for probably some economical reasons. And but maybe we've been putting it on the back burner for too long and using up our soil reserves because this season I did see some potassium deficiency in soybeans. So if you saw some of the yellowing of the leaf margins in your soybeans or even in your corn, I would like you to consider soil testing, of course, taking a look and seeing what that available potassium is, and perhaps consider putting that, feeding that in somehow, building your bank. The next thing about is for nitrogen. So our weather patterns are always just so wonky. And so I could talk today about what I think, and then it's going to be totally different come spring. So my advice is to be prepared to pivot on your idea of application rates and timing. And now after I say that, honestly, you could probably apply the same application rate and timing concept to either condition. And the conditions I'm talking about are, is it going to be really dry or is it going to be really wet? Because it's like either one of the two. Currently, we're really dry. We have an open winter. There's not a lot of snow on the ground. We probably have some volatilization of the anhydrous that maybe somebody put down in the fall. And so come spring, if it's still dry, perhaps we want to consider a split application so we don't have a lot of loss of nitrogen to the environment. But that same concept could be applied if we end up having a really wet spring. We can also lose nitrogen to the environment when we have waterlogged soils. And so think about splitting that application. So this, of course, is in particular to corn, right? Because we don't fertilize soybeans with nitrogen. Corn uses the most amount of nitrogen around the V6 stage. And so to get kind of that half of the rate in the beginning in the spring, and then to apply again closer to V6 will make sure that the nitrogen is still there for your crop to use. So yeah, that would be my thoughts of not really knowing what's going to happen, but what we could do if it does.
Yeah, the best we can do is plan, right? That's what this is all about right now. So I think you mentioned split application. So I want to kind of pivot that, move it over to Andy and side dressing and splits. Is there something you guys look at? Obviously, weather plays a huge important part of that, Andy. But can you talk about what side dressing, what you recommend from that perspective? What you guys are seeing? Any sort of trends in your area on that?
Yeah, so we'll kind of think about side dressing and starters a bit in the same vein. I mean, I think really anytime you have the opportunity to split up your, especially nitrogen applications on corn, you're doing a good job. I mean, we just have so many opportunities to lose our nitrogen throughout the year, and I tell you what, unless you're living in York or Seward County, where the soils are just perfect, right? I mean, there's even more opportunity for loss, and so I guess the tougher soil that you farm, the more challenges. I would say the more opportunity there is for side dressing to pay for you. And as far as like starters, that I don't know. It's one of those things. Everybody's going to love me or hate me, or I think if a starter works for you on your farm, go ahead and use it. But a lot of times we don't see. We might see some green up, but not necessarily any end results when it comes to yield. So saying whether or not to use a starter is kind of like coming right out and asking a stranger, "Are you a Republican or are you a Democrat?" I mean, it's kind of divisive that way, but I think you'll probably hear a lot of us say a lot of the same things throughout our time here today. It depends, So understand your farm, make sure that you're working with somebody that is an advisor, is that you trust, that's there to help advise and work with you on your farm, your specific situations.
Yeah, like yourselves as agronomists or a channel seed pro as well. So, Katherine, one more thing to round out the 2025 kind of look ahead from in your area in Northern Illinois, thinking about maybe what specific programs guys look at up that way, and what you guys are seeing or saw from last year, and what you're thinking about for this year, what you're hearing, I guess, around the coffee shop or the restaurants up there.
Yeah, so kind of similar to what happened the rest of the world. We had a pretty wet spring, and then we turned dry late. So I think we did lose some of that nitrogen early, especially with the leaching that happened from our very wet May, early June timeframe. And so kind of like what Todd said earlier is I don't think a lot of that nitrogen is there anymore. The other thing to think about is across to the ice states, we had some really high yields. And to get that high of a corn crop, we have to pull nutrients and fertility from the soil. So even when it is a high price year and economics aren't the best, it's going to be important to fertilize to our optimum. So I think this is not the year to skimp, especially here in the I states, especially on your potassium and phosphorus. On nitrogen, going back to Andy and Lindsey, it depends on what your farm setup is and what equipment you have, product you have. It all kind of goes down to the 4 R's of soil fertility, right? The right rate, right placement, right source, and right timing. And so, I like side dressing in the spring. I think putting up some either in the fall or spring with anhydrous and then following up with a liquid after emergence prior to about that V6, V7, V8 timeframe. Really, you can add more nitrogen if you've lost some early, and then you are able to put it right next to the plant as it needs it, as that nitrogen requirement really increases in that corn crop. So kind of very similar to what the others have said. We just really got to pay attention to what our soil tests say and use our local trusted advisor to help us make those decisions.
Yeah, good deal. All right, about halfway through here. So got a couple questions from the chat that we'll get to toward the end. So thank you for submitting those who have. Feel free to add some more in. Got a couple more questions prepared to talk through with the group, and then, like I said, we'll pivot to those and wrap it up. So, soil pH, and I'm going to point on Andy on this one because we were talking last week about a specific example he was helping with someone and why this plays an important role with it. So, I'm going to turn this over to Andy because he knows a lot more about it. And fertility programs and why that's important here. So, Andy, I know you had shared this last week with us. I thought maybe it would be a nice opportunity for you to kind of talk about the importance of that and knowing that, again, back to the soil testing and what we need to look at there.
Yeah. So I guess, unfortunately, I do know a fair amount about soil pH, just like what I was talking about earlier, we're kind of all over the board here in Nebraska, from super low pHs to really high pHs. And that's a lot of just through lived experiences, figuring out what to do on different farms. But I'll address the easy one first, I guess, when we're talking about pHs that over time maybe we haven't soil sampled for a number of years. They get low. So say below, I guess I would say below 5.5 for pH would be where I would say it would start affecting yield. And so, we haven't had a lot of snow cover here in most of the Nebraska this year. I think we've got about an inch in the Omaha area. Southeast Nebraska is a little bit different, but I drive down the road these days, and guys are still putting out lime, still putting out dry fertilizer. So having an open winter is not necessarily all bad. We definitely need to recover some moisture, but ag lime that's going out right now is probably the most cost-effective way to amend the soil pH. And so a lot of that depends on the CECs, where the pH is, what your buffer pH, how much you're able to change that, and what you can afford to put on. That ag lime is cheaper. I mean, it's just finely ground limestone, calcium carbonate, and that's going to help raise our pH into that I would call optimum zone, kind of a 6 to 7 pH for growing corn or beans in the area. Another option that's maybe a little bit quicker acting, but more processed, so it's a higher price. But pelletized lime is another way to go out there. Reacts faster, amends the soil faster, but doesn't necessarily last as long. So with all fertility, I guess getting that on a program and kind of a regular rotation when you're going to apply that is definitely a big thing. So
yeah.
On the other side of that, not to talk too long about pH, I mean, it's critical when it comes to everything. I mean, it affects every other nutrient we're going to talk about, right? So but we also have in some of our river valleys, and even in some of the eroded hillsides, we've got too high of a pH, and that can cause problems with nutrient tie-up, but it can definitely cause problems, especially with beans. Iron chlorosis, we call it Platte Valley yellows locally. Not most of the country cares about iron chlorosis, maybe us in Minnesota. There we go, Lindsey. But that's a deal where the pH is too high and we're getting tie up, especially of phosphorus, and that can cause problems where the beans are trying to pull in that iron that's getting tied up, and they can actually pull in other metals at toxic levels to kind of exacerbate the problem. But that's a whole other thing to get into. It is hard to amend soil from a high pH down. Some guys will apply calcium. Off the top of my head, it's not calcium carbonate, it's not lime, but there's calcium sulfate, I believe it is. But the sulfur can help lower that, but it's going to happen over a much longer period. I mean, we're talking probably 8 to 10 years to drop soil pH any kind of noticeable amount. So best recommendation there is just to find products that can tolerate it as best we can, and that way.
Yeah, again, back to the importance of soil testing to know those things, right? If you're doing it regularly, you'll know those answers theoretically quicker. You may have struck a nerve there with the iron in beans. Lindsey, I kind of saw the corner of my eye. You were itching, and maybe Todd, you can speak to this too. I know that's something in your guys' the Northern Plains area. Do you want to kind of talk about that in a little detail there?
Sure. Well, calcium carbonates in general is just something that we battle about 3/4 of our state. Same with what Andy was mentioning about glaciers. We had a glacier come through and drop some parent material that's very high in calcium carbonates, and so just it can make it challenging for growing soybeans in different areas. And maybe not to the level of needing any gypsum or amendment for a high pH, but I just was raising my hand saying that we definitely are battling iron chlorosis or IDC in our soybeans.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I wanted to just touch on real quick about soil testing and this concept of pH, because one thing I was reflecting on is a lot of the growers that I work with, they've been farming for a really long time and they know their soils better than anybody. And that's their concept, or maybe their misconception is, I know my soil, I don't need to test it. Well, things can change over time. Not texture, of course. It takes a long time for sand to turn into silt or clay, but things that do change is pH. And so that would be one of the reasons why it would be important to soil test, is to see if your pH has been changing, and then even if your organic matter, maybe you are lucky and you get to increase your organic matter over time. So we don't always know everything that's happening in our soil, even though we work with it every single day.
Yeah, good call out. Cover crops and no-till fertility programs. Todd, and all of you, certainly, if you can chime in here, but cover crops becoming more, something more guys are willing to try or plant with. Tillage certainly plays a role in some of these aspects. So, Todd, can you talk about how those two programs are two tactics, whether you're growing cover crops or thinking about a no-till program, how those might play a role in any fertility decisions?
Sure. And I know that, in the last few years, we've seen a lot more uptake of cover crop in particular. And then also, to some degree, no-till, and particularly if you look at no-till mainly just on the bean side of things. But I guess as I look at that, specifically looking at the cover crop aspect, a few things to think about there. First of all, on the cover crop where we have, if we have some livestock, are we going to harvest that cover crop in the spring, take it off as feed before we go back? So I guess in consideration of that, what would the nutrient load be taken off with that cover crop in that sense? So I don't know if we necessarily always think through that aspect of it. But on the other side of things, just the cover crop itself can really help to it helps with the soil texture, soil tilth. It can help release some of the nutrients, potassium and phosphorus. It can also help mine some of the nutrients from deeper down in the soil and bring them back up higher up. And and if we're looking at nitrogen aspect, if we do have residual nitrogen deeper down, it can also help hold on to that. And then I guess the last thing is, if you do terminate the cover crop, leave it in the field, you may, again, it's going to be taking up some nutrients. It may take some time for that cover crop to then decompose and release those nutrients back into the soil complex. So be kind of thinking of that, and probably more so on the nitrogen side of things. So sometimes we maybe recommend a little bit higher nitrogen rate, where we have excessive biomass in the spring from those cover crops, just to because we'll have some of that nitrogen tie-ups. So some thoughts on that. And then just real quick on the no-till side of things, the stratification of nutrients, again, particularly potassium and phosphorus in that sense. So anytime that we can get those nutrients into the soil, whether it's, banding, strip till, stuff like that, to help with that stratification can certainly help out. So just some quick thoughts in that respect.
For sure. Good stuff. Katherine, one of the final questions here, and then we'll get into the chat questions. What are some things that farmers tend to overlook as they think about soil fertility? Is it macronutrients? We hear something about, hear a lot sometimes around micro and macros. We're used to the big NP and K. Is what we hear a lot about, but certainly there's lots of other nutrients that play a role in here. Certainly you get that from your soil test, as we've all talked about. But is there something that you've seen over your time as an agronomist that guys tend to overlook when they think about a soil fertility program?
So most of us are all ingrained for NP and K, right? Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. But the one that I'm starting to see a little bit more deficiency here and there is sulfur. We are not getting sulfur anymore through the atmosphere. With environmental regulations, we've cleaned up a lot of the acid rain. And so we're just not getting sulfur like we used to from the atmosphere. And so now we are starting to see more sulfur deficiency in both our corn and soybean crop, kind of depending on where you are, soil type, texture, all that type of stuff. So that would be one of, I don't want to say newer, but a newer thing to also keep an eye on is going to be your sulfur levels. Usually plants don't need too much and you don't need to fertilize a ton for sulfur, but it is something to start paying attention to, as that is one of the bigger macro secondary micronutrients for the crop.
Okay, good deal. All right. Well, we'll do one more quick question for around the room and then get into a couple of the chat questions. Again, if you're listening in, thank you for joining on the first one here. We'll do more of these as we keep going. Hopefully we're bringing some good information to you, and feel free to ask a question in the chat. And if we don't get to it today, we'll get to it our best in responding in the platform on social media. But one comment or two comments from each of you. I'll start with Lindsey here. Lindsey, what is one or two things you want to just kind of put front and center of people's mind as we the calendar getting ready to flip to February? Planting will be here before we know it. Maybe not necessarily North Dakota in a couple of weeks, but for a few others, what are you telling guys as we kind of start thinking about that soil fertility and getting ready for the 2025 season?
Wow. Well, it is 40 degrees today, so it does feel like spring's right around the corner. I guess want to reiterate the importance of soil testing again. I feel like in North Dakota, especially the western side, which is primarily what I cover, I feel like we don't do it enough. I hear so many, because I'll ask, what are your rates or what's your program, and many are just fertilizing what the neighbor is, or just kind of like a common rate, and I feel like there's just a lot more opportunity there. Perhaps we could save some money because maybe you're over fertilizing. Maybe you have a yield goal that you want to achieve, and we need to bump up the fertilizer in order to achieve that. Perhaps we're having some loss to the environment, and again, that's just money basically leaching through the soil. I kind of feel like not using a soil test is maybe putting salt in the
Well, technically,
could come up with there, and so I just can't reiterate enough. And I guess as technical agronomists, we're willing to help you with that. I know reading a soil test can be overwhelming, and in actuality, it's really not that bad, and it doesn't take that long to just take a look at it and come up with a basic idea. Extension resources, and even Channel has a lot of really nice resources where you just reference the soil test, and then you look at the resource and it'll tell you the rates. So
gotcha.
That would be my summary.
Good deal. Thank you. Continuing with ladies first here with Katherine. What's one thing you are thinking about for folks in your area as you get going for 25?
Yeah, so I'll reiterate what Lindsey said about having a soil test and knowing what your ground needs. And I think the other important idea is also, if you have the ability of pivoting your nitrogen, depending on how this spring sets up, are you going to put it on ahead of the crop? Are you going to do a side dress application? And how much are you going to do when? The other thing to think about is we've pulled off tremendous yields the past couple years here in Illinois. And that yield has to come from somewhere, and a lot of it does come from the soil. And so really think about what your removal rates are, what you're fertilizing to. I don't think we need to go overboard, but we also don't need to skimp either this year, especially if we're shooting for that high-end yield potential.
Good call. Todd, what about you guys for Southeast Minnesota?
Again, it's the same thing, soil test, and don't skimp on potassium year in, year out. That's just make sure you get the potassium down. So 2 simple thoughts right there.
Very good. Thank you. Andy, and rounding out the year, Eastern Nebraska.
Yep. So, like I mentioned earlier, commodity prices always a concern. I mean, they're never high enough, right? And everybody's always watching their costs. So there's always attempt to do something new and crazy. Make sure that you trust who you're working with. There's a lot of things out there, new and exciting. I mean, I think it's the next best thing, but a lot of microbials that we're able to add to the soil now. So trust the salesperson, test and see, make sure that it does what it says it's going to do. If something is saying that it's going to replace all of your nitrogen in the soil, maybe take another look at that before you just jump all in. Lots of good products out there, but evaluate them. Speaking of, I guess I saw there was one in the chat specifically about a product, and I don't want to talk up or talk down a product, but the question was around soy green for IDC beans. I have had some personal experience with it, and I'll say typically when it's applied foliarly, we'll see some nice green up. But it typically doesn't do a lot to change our yield or really keep the plants alive for much longer than it's in the plant. Where I have seen it work better is probably when guys put it in furrow. Seems to last longer, get into the plant, and do a better job that way. So yeah, great products. They can be pricey. So again, test and see if it's worth using it on your farm.
Yep, good deal.
Yeah, with the soy green comment. And Andy's correct. I have just looked at some North Dakota State research. I've seen it on farm a little bit with the same result as he's saying, that foliar doesn't have the same result as having it in furrow. And so from what I understand is happening with this chelated iron is not only is it giving the plant the immediate need for iron, because iron is a part of chlorophyll, and so you need chlorophyll for the green, yada yada, right? But what it also does, and why it might be having more of an impact, in the soil, is the chelated iron will also tend to grab on to the other iron that's already existing in the soil, and then help make it plant available. So if it's foliar, it doesn't have the ability to do that action.
Hey, thanks for bringing the first yada yada to our conversation. We appreciate that.
You got a lot of yada yadas.
A lot of yadas. Good sign.
But make sure you soil test and be sure you're at the level where you think an amendment like that would pay off. Because otherwise, again, just using a variety, IDC tolerant variety, could just be, the best way.
For sure. Yep. One question from the chat here, and I think Lindsey, I'll throw this your way. Does spreading compost actually help corn yields? Can you really cut out nutrients out of your normal fertility program that the compost provides on a nutrient test? Can you answer that one for us?
Sure. So I had a really close friend, and her job was like promoting poop. And I learned quite a bit from her. And yes, so using compost or manure has good nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium levels in it. When you're using compost, you want to make sure that it's been processed correctly. I can't remember exactly what the temperature it is, but when you pile and roll that manure, it needs to come to a certain temperature to be identified as compost. But either way, I'll just cut to the chase. We can treat manure or compost like other fertilizer input, but it is an organic substance. So you may not see the immediate response because the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, they need to break down. The microbes in the soil need to break down the state that they're in order it to be plant available. Because when we use commercially created fertilizers, a lot of that is available immediately. So with manure, again, just to repeat myself, it needs to go through the process. So I think only 50% of the nitrogen is available in year one when it comes to manure compost, and then over time it will mineralize and become available to the plants. So it's definitely a process.
Yep.
But if you have cattle, why not use your free resource of poop? So, and then so now I'm the first person to say poop.
You are, yeah. Money was on me.
Backing it up.
You took the cake there, so thank you for deflecting off of me. Another quick question here, and it relates to some of, I think, a comment I had earlier, but Channel C pros, agronomists, or sort of relying on a local agronomist with an appropriate degree. I think that's, all the above can provide some insight. Maybe Katherine, if you could take this, or Todd, just talking about that connectivity with your seed pro as a local agronomist, and just sort of, certainly relying on extension and or local research too. Just why I think maybe they all sort of play a role, but I could be wrong.
No, you're right on the money, Nick. So a lot of local seed pros are, while they might not be a trained agronomist, classically trained agronomists, they are still an agronomist. They are out walking fields, helping their customers be that trusted advisor for their ground. And so those would be a great resource. Another good resource is your local technical agronomist from Channel. And besides from the Channel brand, those other local agronomists that might work for your co-op, or might be an independent consultant, or might be a certified crop advisor, those people are also good resources to have. And each of them has their expertise and some resources to tap into when you're looking for another opinion of what you might do for your ground.
Yeah. As we've kind of learned over the last 30 plus minutes, fertility is a complex discussion and topic. And so, a lot of the more resources you can tap into, whether that's with your seed company, co-ops, extension. It's all about learning and doing what's best for your farm and your local operation. So, with that, I think we'll get this thing wrapped up. And I appreciate all of you joining us for the first ever Channel Office Hours, where we tap into some hot agronomy topics and get folks prepared for the next part of the season. We'll try to do these on a monthly basis. So I want to thank all our agronomists on the call here. Thank you for your time and expertise and providing some insight. Thank you for watching. If you're watching still and you have some questions, or you rewatch this, pop them in our social media channels on direct messages or comments, and we'll do our best to get to those answers. Look for additional commentary from these agronomists soon enough in these spaces. And we thank you again for watching, and have a great afternoon. Have a great morning and afternoon, for that matter. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Catch you next time.
Thank you.
Bye.